you've ever been interested in horror, but have just been too scared to take that leap, here are 5 books to gently ease you into the world of horror fiction. And I get it, because there are a lot of different kinds of horror, a lot of different stages, levels of intensity when it comes to horror. But also for that exact reason, some of these books might not work for you. You might end up reading one of these books and be very angry at me because it was just too scary. And other seasoned horror fans might look at these and go, these aren't even horror, these aren't even scary, something toxicity. I cannot promise that these 5 books are perfect for you as a beginner, as someone new to the world of horror. Because fear and horror and terror, these are subjective things, but I've got my reasons for each of them, and I'll explain them as we go. So let's jump in. Here are 5 books to get you into the horror genre. It makes sense to start with a classic. This is Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, and it was the first vampire story, predating Bram Stoker's Dracula by 26 years. It's a novella, so it's nice and short. You can read it in a day or 2. People usually think that older stories are not going to be as scary as newer ones, for one reason or another, but Carmilla is creepy. It's a fun and strange gothic vampire story, but there are really creepy moments in this book, especially in its very first chapter, where our protagonist, Laura, describes something entering her bedroom. She lives in a big, mostly empty castle in Austria, and one night something creeps into her bedroom. And the way that thing is described and her interaction with it, whether it be a dream or not, is really chilling. Genuinely, it's a kind of campfire story. It's got that campy, fun excitement to it. You could imagine someone reading this story to you by the fireside. It's eerie, it's gothic, it'll make you shudder, but I don't think it's anything you couldn't handle. And it's nice to start here because this is such an old tale. It is a classic gothic story. The first great vampire story, the progenitor of so much horror and gothic fiction. And it's genuinely a twisted and creepy tale. And I really think you can handle this. Carmilla tells the story of Laura, a young girl who's pretty lonely. She and her father live in this big castle, and one day Laura gets a playmate, the titular Carmilla. Also a young girl whose mother leaves her at the castle and just kind of goes somewhere. It's not clear exactly who this mother and daughter even are and why the daughter was left here. Their carriage crashes in front of the castle and the mother says, "I'm so sorry, I have somewhere I have to go. Please look after my daughter. I will be back." Carmilla and Laura become fast friends and even develop a romantic interest in each other because this is an early work of sapphic fiction as well. But Carmilla, unsurprisingly, is a vampire. I'll leave it there. This is a great introduction to horror fiction and gothic fiction. It's a twisted, dark, gothic fairy tale. A new novel that I read relatively recently is The House That Horror Built by Christina Henry. Henry at this point is quite a modern legend of horror fiction. She kind of established herself by taking old stories, old works of fiction and fairy tales, and twisting them up and making them new, reinventing them as something darker. She's done it with Alice from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. She did it with The Headless Horseman from Sleepy Hollow. And now she's written a few good thrillers and horror novels inspired by nothing at all. And one of them is The House That Horror Built. What's nice about this as an introduction to horror is that it plays on horror tropes and themes, but not in such a way that it's reliant on them and that you'll get more out of it if you're a hardened horror fan, because this book isn't really that scary at all. And what's nice is that although it's full of all of these tropes and aesthetics and nods to horror, especially horror cinema, instead of seeing it as a cheeky wink to the fans, it's almost like a teaser for what else is out there. The titular house is that of a horror film director who's become very reclusive. His house is full of costumes and props from films he's made and films that he's a fan of. He's got a xenomorph from Alien, for example. And if you're a horror fan, you're gonna go, "Oh, I know these things." And if you're not a horror fan, you're gonna go, I wonder what that is. You don't need any more context to appreciate the novel, they're just cameo things. And the book kind of invites you to explore the world of horror cinema, which is great. I love that approach. The idea that something can have lots of nods and winks to a larger world, and instead of it being exclusive, it's very inclusive to new fans and readers. You read this book and you wonder what else is out there. That's really cool. Another reason I think this is great for new fans of horror is that it's also, maybe even more so, a family drama in a horror setting. And that's something I really like about so much modern American horror in particular. So many American horror novels of the 20th and 21st centuries are about family dramas and friendships and romances. The novels of Paul Tremblay, Stephen King, and Joe Hill come to mind as well. And I think this does it really well for people who aren't big fans of horror, at least not yet. This is about a woman in her 30s who has a teenage son, and she's just trying to get by to support him as a single mother. It's very relatable, it's very empathetic, it asks you to care immediately about their circumstances, and she happens to be a big fan of horror films, as does her son. They bond over watching horror movies together, and she takes a job cleaning a big mansion in Chicago. Turns out that mansion is owned by a horror director that she and her son are big fans of. He used to live in LA, but he was embroiled in a big scandal to do with his son, and now he lives in a mansion at the edge of Chicago. And she didn't know it was him, but now she gets to meet one of her heroes, and so does her son. And perhaps my favorite thing about this is the relationship between this mother and son, and how the horror director fits into their relationship as boss and potential friend, maybe even a father figure to this boy. All the while, his house is full of secrets and dread. The book does build up to a pretty exciting climax, but at no point did I feel genuinely terrified. There were a few creepy moments. For example, there's an empty costume of this demonic thing that was in one of his films, and the costume starts to move. Its eyes follow you across the room. Even its head starts to turn. I think that's the most memorable creepy moment from the novel. But more than being frightening, this is a tantalizing and eerie mystery. And if you enjoy drama, especially family drama, you are welcomed into a world of family drama that happens to be in a horror setting, a potential haunted house. It's not going to terrify you. It's a nice way to ease you into horror, and you'll get a good family drama out of it. Win-win. Much like how The House That Horror Built is a horror novel set within a family drama, Patricia Wants to Cuddle by Samantha Allen is also a horror novel set within the drama of a reality TV show. Our protagonists are the cast and crew of a Bachelor-style TV show where a group of hot young women compete for the hand of some guy who's probably rich and probably handsome, etc. And the TV show is being filmed on this isolated island off the coast of Washington state. It is cold, it is wet, it's pretty dark, and it's a heavily forested island, and there is something living in that forest. This novel is fun and funny, it's sardonic, it's very queer, and the queerness gets revealed slowly as it goes. It's got a very, very tantalizing cover and title, but if you're in the States right now, the US cover for this book is, well, it gives more away. That cover is a kind of riff on King Kong, and I think that offers up too much immediately, while also being slightly misguided. Patricia Wants to Cuddle is full of gore though, especially as it goes on. There are some gruesome deaths, because this is basically a slasher, with some unknowable monster as the slasher thing. Slashers are full of gore, but slashers are also camp and mysteries. They are whodunits, and they are often goofy and rely on silly tropes. And for that reason, the gore often feels offset by a sense of tongue-in-cheek humour, and I think that really helps. Gore can be funny. I'm not saying the deaths in here are all funny, but there's this sort of metronome flicking back and forth between fun and terror. And I really think that's a great place to start for someone who wants to get into horror fiction. You're prepared for death and blood. You know it's going to happen, so it's good that it's happening in a story that's funny and sarcastic and kind of satirical and also delightfully queer. To return us to the vampire for a second, another one of those great American horror authors who's very good at writing about interpersonal stories and dramas within communities, groups of friends and families, and just happens to set those in a kind of horror scenario. That was a very long sentence, I lost my train of thought. Anyway, I mentioned Paul Tremblay and Stephen King and his son Joe Hill. There's also Grady Hendrix. And Hendrix's books are all horror, or at least horror themed. And there is a difference. They're definitely not all equally scary. How to Sell a Haunted House, for example, is a really fun novel, but it also has some really creepy, terrifying moments in it. The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, however, I don't think this book is scary. It is very much a new take on the Dracula style of vampire, returning the vampire to being a metaphor for certain kinds of threats on certain kinds of people. Dracula can be read as the other, the foreigner, the queer, the thing of a different race and culture invading something that is pure. I've talked about this a lot in my vampire video. You can go watch that if you like. This book is also in that video. And in this book, we see a return to that kind of vampire. But in this, the vampire is a middle-class white man who burrows into a peaceful, white, comfortable suburban community. And all the while, he preys on the underclass, people of ethnic minorities who live in nearby neighborhoods, who are poor and vulnerable. This vampire has built a kind of shell around himself by ingratiating himself into a wealthy white community whilst preying on a poor black community. It's a pretty good political commentary, but it is one written by a middle-class white guy, so keep that in mind. Our protagonists are a group of women who are all married to these very comfortable middle-class men. It's set in the 90s, they're all housewives, and they have a book club. And one of them has a sneaking suspicion that this new guy who's just moved in is a vampire. And she steps up to the plate to deal with this and tries to wrangle the other women into helping her as well. But it's really not an easy thing for her to do. And at no point was I even slightly scared by this novel. It's very Dracula inspired and it's very horror themed. And yeah, there's blood and death and the threat of violence and the threat of killings. And it's upsetting because innocent, vulnerable people are being preyed upon by a wealthy vampire man. But at no point was I scared, was I frightened. And for that reason, I think this is a great introduction to horror. And a good introduction to Grady Hendrix, because everything else he's written is scarier than this. And finally, we have Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle. I need to say up front, the reason Chuck Tingle's horror is so good for new readers is not because it's not scary. There are really scary moments in his books, but it's because his books are ultimately about love. That's Chuck Tingle's whole thing. He's been writing funny queer erotica for years. And when he turned his hand to horror, he kept that philosophy intact. That love between friends, between romantic partners, between families, love is what wins out. For that reason, you can kind of safely root for protagonists to get through things, be alive at the end, and win against the darkness because they had faith in themselves, they loved and supported each other, etc. It's a lovely thing. Chuck Tingle believes that love is all that really matters. It's the glue that bonds us together, and he's right. And for that reason, his horror books come highly recommended. The only thing is that his other horror novel, Camp Damascus, which I do think is better than Bury Your Gaze, is also a lot scarier. There are some really chilling moments, especially in the first act of that novel. Camp Damascus is not always an easy read. It has a terrifying opening section, and then it moves into something more action-packed at the end, like really gnarly, like a heavy metal music video. Bury Your Gaze is a bit more subtle, a bit more quiet, not as scary, but just as much about love. Our protagonist is a man who writes for Hollywood. He's been writing a TV show for a long time. He's written horror movies. He's gay and closeted, and he writes very queer-coded protagonists. One day, he is told by his studio that his plan to reveal that his two female protagonists of his TV show are in fact gay and love each other and get to have an on-screen kiss, all of that cannot happen. The studios say, nope, you have two choices. You either make both of them straight, retcon the whole thing, just ignore the fact that there were so many queer-coded moments between them, ignore it all, they're straight now. Or you let them have their on-screen kiss and they immediately die in a blaze of glory, thus Burying Your Gaze. If you don't know what that is, it's a trope where queer people can be queer on screen as long as they are killed off and the straight people are just A-okay. He says no, and subsequently he starts getting stalked and chased out in public on the streets of Los Angeles by the very things he's created, by the monsters and killers of his own stories. It's absolutely wild. It's a lot of fun. It's creepy, it's scary in places, but you can handle it, I promise. And in the end, love will win. That's all I can say without spoiling things. Chuck Tingle's wonderful. His other book, Camp Damascus, is honestly my favourite horror novel of all time. And I think Bury Your Gaze is a great place to start. And yes, of course, there's a lot of queerness in this list. I'm very queer. So enjoy. I really hope you like these 5 books. If they end up traumatizing you, I'm really sorry. Like I said at the beginning, horror is subjective. The things that frighten us are subjective. And if you think, wow, yeah, I could handle these easily. These were great. Thanks so much. I've got lots of other recommendations for you. Enjoy and subscribe for books.